Welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper. This week we're talking about learning and why it's definitely not just for school days. How do we continue to learn throughout our decades? How do we find our learning edge? How do we keep ourselves there? And what are the benefits of doing so? Oh, and just for good measure, let's throw in growth mindset. It's definitely more than jargon. So join us for being at your edge. Hello, Bridget.
Hi, Bobby.
So, learning. I wondered if I could throw a question into the mix immediately for you. You sound nervous. I can almost hear your breathing changing.
No, ask away, Bobby.
All I was going to ask was, well, I guess about your learning journey and how you think it has changed from school to through the military. I mean, have you seen it change? Do you have preferred ways of learning, etc., etc.? Let's just open it up like that to begin with.
Okay. I guess at school, I think throughout my life, I've loved learning. It's not something that I've shied away from. I have always liked to gain knowledge or understanding, probably more importantly. I think when I was younger, it was just about, knowledge, because that's what we're taught at school, isn't it? That we just absorb all this knowledge and then they squeeze us and we're supposed to be able to send it out in rote form, which probably dates me and I suspect you as well in terms of educational approach. And then when I started studying in my 30s and 40s, it was much more about understanding and being able to apply things. And for me particularly, I tend to be a bit of a synergist, I guess. I like to link up people and ideas. So if I see something or spot something that I'm reading about, I'm quite good at going, oh, that person needs to know that. This person in my network would benefit from that. Or the same with people. If I hear people are talking about certain ideas, I kind of like to smash other people together in a totally non-violent way.
I like that. And I think the interesting thing that you were saying was about the gaining of knowledge, because before we came on to start the recording, I was looking at how we learn, the different ways of doing it. And I came across this article which gave a whole load of ideas. And it really was for, those youngsters, teens, or how they learn and how to do that thing that they need from a school perspective. And it sounded so completely different with the things that they were talking about compared to, dare I say it, when you and I were at school, which seemed so much more about, that book learning, rote learning, listening to the teacher, copying stuff off whiteboards, blah, blah, or blackboards, should I even say at the time. I did progress to a whiteboard before I left school, but only just. But it was just interesting just to talk about some of those things that they were saying about varying techniques and trying teaching someone else and the hands-on action, like the practical experience of things. Mistakes being part of the process, a little bit every day, testing yourself and focusing on one thing. Now, some of that, struck me as, the testing yourself and maybe trying to teach somebody else when, you went through your notes with another person. But I think there's a greater understanding now. But I also then went to look at the varying of techniques. And I know very much so that my learning style was probably visual, because of reading and mind mapping and taking notes. Just as a digress, the thing I found interesting about the taking notes was that this research I was looking at said that longhand notes, as in writing in a notebook as such, cement information more effectively than digital note-taking, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, I can feel that, because I know that when I did my law degree, it was a postgraduate diploma, but it's effectively 3 years of law crammed into one before we went off to become baby barristers or baby solicitors, depending on which way we went, whether we turned left or right. I have always learnt by writing down and by reading. So very much the same as you. So I guess there's a kinesthetic and a visual learning there. But once I'd written my notes down, and then when I was revising for these hellish exams at the end of the year, I had discovered mind mapping, as you mentioned. It's Tony Buzan, I think. I'd got a little mind map book from Tony Buzan, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it was game changing for me in that I could put a whole topic, criminal law or constitutional law, land law, onto one page with colours and the mind map and then little drawings to remind me of things. Actually, the criminal law one was always fascinating because the one bit that all law students are always interested in is learning about different types of assault. So where sadomasochism comes in, just going on a massive digression here, but any law students listening I suspect will all go, yep, because those set of cases that decided whether or not you could consent to certain physical activities or abuse effectively or assault, and what constituted assault if people had consented to it, is really, really quite gruesome but titillating and interesting. And so I had all kinds of weird and wonderful little pictures to just remind me rather than actually have to write it all down. So luckily I think all of my mind maps from when I was studying law have been thrown out, otherwise I'd probably frame them now. So I could be the new sort of legal Banksy. Anyway, I digress. Yes, so the learning, I think that a lot of people struggle with learning and will say, I'm really bad at learning. I'm really bad at being able to gather information. So some of the stuff we may talk about in growth mindset is this idea that some people have an innate talent. Some people are clever and therefore they're going to be able to, they're going to be academic, and some people aren't clever. And I do think that we need to get away from that idea that, it's all about innate talent, because it isn't. And that's why growth mindset is so important.
Hold that thought for when we get to growth mindset, because what you've just described, and I think that's what you're saying, is not a growth mindset. But thank you so much for that really rather peculiar digression that you made in order to explain mind mapping to everybody. All I was going to say was that I was really delighted to know that writing longhand notes, because it basically allows me to embrace my complete love of stationery and notebooks. But I think that the varying of techniques was what was interesting to me as well, because I know in myself that I have perhaps been over-reliant on visual, the note-taking, the mind mapping, the reading. And of course, what they're saying about learning is to vary the technique. So when it was talking about verbally, is learning with a friend, and the other one being auditory. So in actual fact, what I have found with doing these podcasts is that I have found a new way of learning, because it's both the auditory and the verbal, because I'm listening to stuff a lot more than I ever did before. I'm also rather hopeful that with people listening to these podcasts, that in amidst your peculiar digressions about God knows what on mind maps, people will have something to learn about our own experiences in an auditory way. But I learned so much just by being in conversation with you. So, there's a level of gratitude in the learning, but all of a sudden, without even realizing I was doing it, there was an aha moment today that I am varying my technique and what I'm gaining from that.
Yeah. And I do wonder, I think maybe I've discussed this, I can't remember whether I've discussed it with you or with someone else now. This is my menopause brain coming in. But I've mentioned before that I'm studying for a postgraduate diploma in creativity, innovation and leadership at UCD. And one of the things I've enjoyed, but also being challenged by, is that so much of the learning is self-learning in groups with play or with sort of very random things that are very untraditional ways of learning compared to how we both probably learnt at school. And so there is very much, as you say, this way of we're learning from each other in groups, or we're learning as we go along, where we have these aha moments. But what's been wonderful is the amount of fun that you can have while you're still learning. And I do think that for many people, there's this belief that there's a dichotomy. It's either learning or it's fun. And they don't seem to feel that, and maybe that does relate to some traumas from school, which I think is such a shame that once kids get from that time where, where you're at preschool and you're allowed to play and you're learning and everyone understands that play is learning, that you're learning your words and you're learning your numbers by games. But suddenly there's a point in education where that all stops and it's just we sit there and you're supposed to be funnel fed, I guess, like they do with geese to make foie gras or something like that. It's just sort of a funnel put into their ear and just information just poured in and they're just supposed to assimilate it like the Borg. I'm using lots of very mixed metaphors now.
Honestly,
yeah, I think that
what did you have for lunch? I mean, we've gone from some weird frigging mind maps to now talking about geese. I'm trying to keep up. I want you to hold that thought, because I think that this business about how children get taught, not geese, but how children get taught, will take us on to the learning age. But I did just want to throw in a little anecdote with your talk about play and how you learn. And it just put me in mind of when I was first starting down my coaching development. So, of course, here's this person in this body who has been institutionalized in different formats, be it at school or from the military, still holding on very much to these particular ways of learning, had started to enter into woo-woo land a little bit with the way that the coaching, or that's what it felt like at the time from the coaching development. And I end up in San Francisco at this coaching conference. And there was a 4-day precursor thing that I thought, I'm going to sign up for that as well. And I remember going into the room thinking, oh, this all looks rather extraordinary, because there weren't any tables about or anything. There was just lots of paper on the floor and paint. And then I noticed cowboy hats and water pistols and crayons and jelly beans. And basically, we had 2 hours of stuffing our face with jelly beans to give ourselves some kind of huge sugar rush like kids get. And I was trying to paint a picture on the floor while there were other people running around having a water fight. I remember being absolutely furious because I got water all over my painting and they destroyed it. And like a child, I went ballistic. So then picked up the water pistol to participate. There were people drawing with these thankfully correct crayons for glass, but drawing like psychedelic, God knows what, all over the windows of this conference room. So this was exactly what was going on. But we were opposite a bank, high-rise building, and these people just looking through the window going, what the hell are they doing? But whatever it generated in the body, along with the jelly beans, to then be in a very different space from which to learn, and the connections that we had created as a result of this 2 hours of, basically behaving like children, were phenomenal. And it does nicely, if I may, segue onto what I'm going to say next about this, what is a learning edge? And I came across, this sounds very grand, this isn't like me, but, bear with, this education theorist called Howard Gardner, who talks about the learning edge. And basically, if I can try to describe what he'd basically drawn this blob, like so it's got boundaries to it, but it looks a bit amorphous and that it could change shape quite a lot. And in the middle of that blob was the word known. So that's our knowledge. We've used the word knowledge, right? And then outside of that is unknown. And what he was saying, and I think if I can try to make the connection with that rather crazy jelly bean story I've just told, is that where learning happens is at that boundary. So if you try to go too far away from the boundary, you can't learn. So that's the premise to it. So, it's a bit like saying to somebody who's just learned to count to 5, okay, now we're going to go on to algebra. That's too far away. And again, that boundary is ever changing. because of the environment you're with, the people that you're with, or whatever it might be. And I think it will, I'd like to talk more about that learning edge piece, but I think that that's the thing that enables something of the growth versus the fixed mindset, because I know that my learning ability really changed in that moment, whatever was in the jelly beans. But I allowed myself to be more amorphous. The boundary got changed.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes loads of sense. And I do think that that's why it's so important that we, as everyone, but particularly educators, really, really embrace this idea that people learn in different ways. And there has to be this huge flexibility. And absolutely means that educators have an incredibly difficult job, because they do have to be able to be flexible to be able to ensure that everybody can learn. Especially with neurodiversity, it becomes even more difficult to be able to sort of try and help or teach in ways that can appeal to everybody, or to each of the different elements that we need. And so, yeah, I completely agree that that sort of element of play takes, I don't know, for many people, if you have a block about learning, because, as I said, from some trauma where you were taken beyond the edge, and I know for myself that I get incredibly frustrated if I don't understand something. And so, and to the, it just, my whole brain just shuts down. I think we were talking in another episode about how we sort of crunch up and make ourselves smaller. And I think that I do that because suddenly the world doesn't make sense to me anymore. And I really struggle with that. And I do remember there were a couple of times where I was trying to learn or being taught something that just was obviously beyond that edge, and there needed to be an intermediary stage. And you told me that you think physics was a massive bugbear for you. And it was for me too. And I do think that I really struggle to find some of those intermediary points. And I still have an issue about maths, numbers, and physics. I have those blocks because I obviously was pushed at some point beyond my edge. And I then had this sort of very, very huge reaction to it. And I think that many of us do have some sort of block, and putting things into play where it's just like, you're not learning, forget about the learning, just focus on the fun, and you can cleverly incorporate some learning elements so that you kind of trick your brain into forgetting about the block.
I completely agree. And I think that will come out when we head into the realms of the growth mindset and the things that trigger us to go back to fixed. But before that, I thought this was interesting from this theorist's state as well, because there's play. I think there's the other thing about how you can learn about different things. So I'm not suggesting that, I'd have ever got better at physics if somebody had decided to put it to music. Well, you never know. But I think if I'd have been able to correlate physics, for example, with sport, and somebody had taught it to me through a different medium, it might have made more sense. I mean, I think now about how I feel about looking at neuroscience and neurodiversity, because it feels so much more purposeful to the other things that I'm doing, which is why I want to learn. And this chap talks about there being 7 territories, and we are always in this amorphous state between known and unknown. And I think it plays to what you're saying about the things that you struggled with, where there's still that like a defense mechanism mode to it. But he talks about the 7 territories. So there's language, so reading, writing, storytelling. There's the logic, maths bit. But I think, and again, it was interesting with the things that he plugged in there. So of course he talks about arithmetic, where I go, oh God, no, get me a calculator. But equally, what he's saying there is about patterns and puzzles. I love a puzzle. So that there's ways of expanding it differently. There's music. So music being the singing, the sound, but listening, that active listening piece that we keep saying we must do an episode on that. But there's that. Spatial reasoning, which goes about mazes, Lego for crying out loud, but drawing and things like that. Movement, so dance, sport, making things. Interpersonal intelligence, which is about communications, empathy, understanding others, and intrapersonal intelligence, poetry, self-reflection, self-understanding. And, we've got edges to every single territory. There will be those that we feel more comfortable in or we're more expansive in. Our boundaries are wider because of whatever experiences that we've actually had, and those that are smaller. And when we start getting into the, how to be in your learning zone, how to build the growth mindset, there's all of those things at play all the time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. So there's a guy called Sir Ken Robinson, he's passed away now, but he was a great education advocate, and he railed strongly against sort of having these fixed curricula in schools. And he argued that this rote learning, as I said, the pouring information in one end and expecting it all to be sort of just regurgitated out onto a page once a year or at certain key ages, that kills creativity. And I also think it doesn't just kill creativity, but it kills the ability for us to value all of those other really important types of learning and those abilities to create a rounded human being. And that we praise in the education system, we praise intelligent, clever people who've been able to remember, because effectively that's what, I just am very good at remembering. I used to be able to write things down and I would remember them, and then I could spill them out again for my O-levels. And we've already said how old that makes us. And everyone would be like, oh no, that's brilliant, you're so clever. But actually, in lots of other ways, in terms of a human being, a rounded human being, there were lots of things that I was definitely not as rounded in, and other people were, but they weren't valued for it. And so I do think it's such a shame that, God, how many years since we were at school, too many to mention, that it's still the same, that kids are terrified and parents are going into paroxysms and kids having anxiety attacks about their exams as if it's the end of the world, it's the only thing that matters. And yet nobody's going, but you are great at listening, you're empathetic, you've got emotional intelligence, you're creative. None of those things are important. It's just whether or not you got whatever grade in your exams, and it's the end of the world if you don't do well.
I was shocking at exams. Sir Ken Robinson, unless I'm making things up, I'm pretty sure that he was one of my gifts about creativity at Christmas. And his TED talk,
yes, he was.
It's brilliant. We'll pop it in the references afterwards, because again, this whole conversation is very much about what he was saying. I think he was brilliant, in terms of his arguments about education. And I was going to say, in the very small part that I play now as a governor, they talk about scaffolding. I've been going, what the hell, scaffolding? Well, I know what scaffolding is, but in the premise of education. And I was reading something in preparation for this where they say that scaffolding is about encouragement, it's questions for next steps, and it's a reminder of what's been achieved. So you don't leave it all to grading a paper. And I think that scaffolding piece may well happen very well at primary school, and then we drum that out of it. Or it certainly felt like that from my history with education, and it just been about exams, which I was terrible at. And that continued. Trying to do qualification exams or whatever from the military, I failed them badly because I was much better practically than being put in front of a book and told to do well on a test. Just wasn't the way I learned.
Yeah,
but
damaging.
I think the other thing, though, and this may well bring us to explore growth mindset, but again, from the reading, and I tend to go a lot when I'm talking about anything to do with the growth mindset, Carol Dweck, who is an American psychologist. She's Harvard Business Review. There's TED Talks. Again, we'll stick the links in. But she talks about the misconceptions of what is a growth mindset. And one of those, and I think that this goes back to the element to it as well, that you've just been talking about the test paper and the 100% versus the 50%, is just about praising and rewarding effort. No, outcomes matter. But the fact is, on a test paper, or the way that we test education, is that that's somebody who can put in a lot of effort to learn. It's not that I didn't put in a lot of effort, but to learn in a particular way. But are they able to then practically apply it for an outcome? afterwards. And then you put that into the workplace, unproductive effort is not a good thing. There's got to be learning and progress. I don't know if I'm trying to match the two things together, but I think it takes us into that. That's one of the misconceptions, is that you haven't necessarily got a growth mindset if you just make a large effort.
Yeah, and weirdly, how spooky. We've obviously been looking at the same article because, I think that what you've just said in terms of this idea of, so yeah, it's great. Bridge, Bobby, you're having a chat about learning. Well, interesting. But what's that got to do with us as leaders in organizations? And I think that that's this, one of the other fallacies that Dweck had identified was that this idea, which I think I probably have been guilty of, is that a growth mindset, and lots of people go, I've got a growth mindset. And they think that it just means that you're open-minded, you've got positive outlook, you're willing to consider new ideas. And actually, she was saying that it's not really that, because we have to recognize that we've all got a fixed and a growth mindset. And actually, a fixed mindset is important in lots of things, like jumping off a cliff is likely to be dangerous unless you're attached to a parachute or a rope. And even then, possibly still quite dangerous, depending on who tied the knots. But, so we have a lot of fixed mindsets, and no amount of being optimistic is going to change that. And the fixed mindset is there to protect us. It's there to limit us to stop us doing sort of crazy dangerous things, unless we particularly want to go and do crazy dangerous things. But we have to balance those two elements of ourselves so that we apply a growth mindset when we need to find solutions, when we need to grow, but that we also recognize that not everything has to be about a growth mindset. That was quite interesting. And I do think that that's really applicable in organizations too, sort of constantly going, we have to change everything. Actually, we have to be really circumspect in that thing. Some things are working, and it's a bit like, what's the phrase, throwing baby out with the bathwater. If we need to change, we still need to be analytical about what elements need to change and where we need to apply a change, changing thought, and where we need to go, let's keep with some of this knowledge that we already have, and it doesn't, that's still valuable. But your point about effort, again, really applicable in terms of organizations, is that, just the clapping and giving awards for effort isn't what growth mindset is, but it's about rewarding things like lessons learned, collaboration. So it's not about, you necessarily achieved what the objective was, but it's about looking and saying, but you've changed. You have grown in terms of how you did this. You've found a new way of working. You took some risks. And I guess there's a link to psychological safety here as well, in terms of sort of allowing people to try new things and rewarding them for the effort of coming up with a new way, but not just, I tried really hard, but I didn't actually do anything.
I agree.
Different.
And I think the other thing that, and again, yes, we definitely have been reading the same stuff about Dearest Carol, I think. But the other thing that I'd say, when this correlation of growth mindset or implementing it in an organization is all about change, I agree, it's not necessarily that. And this balance about growth and fixed, I think you said right at the beginning, that business about innate gifts, which is the way that she describes the fixed piece. So there's things that we're good at, right? So you're good at learning and you're good at tests, exams. I am not. I might be better at throwing a javelin than you are. Maybe not anymore, but I used to be. But what I was going to say is that rather than growth mindset being correlated necessarily with change, I think it's the things that we, the royal we or organisations do. So growth mindset for me is about input from others, feedback, being collaborative, worrying less about looking smart been enthusiastic and you're putting your energy into learning, you have an appetite for learning, to flex that boundary that we were talking about, to pull in more. There's probably other things as well. But your point that I was also going to raise about the psychological safety, I agree that there's got to be that level of it in order for the growth mindset to feel safe, because the growth mindset also means about taking calculated risks, being innovative, learning from mistakes, and as I said, seeking the feedback. And if you are an organization that focuses, that does all of that thing in their mission statement, tralala, but we invest in talent and all of those throwaway phrases, knowing that you've got to be the cream of the crop, to be defined in some organizations as talented, actually will drive you straight back into fixed mindset potentially, because you ain't going to share info in case that person gets ahead of you. You're not going to be so up for collaborating. You're not going to tell anyone when you've made a frigging mistake, and all of a sudden you begin to drive the behavior that you've been suggesting is not the one that you actually want, because what creeps in then is competition and comparing yourself to others, when in actual fact your growth mindset is entirely your own. So everybody's individual in that. And then the organization has got to create that psychologically safe space for that to actually happen. So I think, you can stick whatever you want on a mission statement, but there's a lot of other different things that then have to go on to make that a reality and something that you can tangibly feel.
I think the problem with a fixed mindset is it assumes that everyone is at a fixed state and that things can't change. And so that people who have or appear to have an innate talent, so maybe that's throwing javelin or doing exams, most of that is not genetic. It came from maybe a spark of innate talent, but an awful lot of work and an awful lot of support. So there are plenty of people who might be born with that spark, but it hasn't lit up because it hasn't had the effort and the support that it needed to turn into a flame of talent. And so that, I think, is the harm in the fixed mindset, is that, I can't get better, or I am this, I can't be that. And that everything is sort of predetermined and genetic. And it leaves out the fact that we can all learn new things. We can all become better with effort and support. I think that this idea that, as you say, we've identified these people as talented, or they bring in talent, that the organisations go, we've brought in talent. And everyone else is sat there going, well, you fucking saying that we're all fucking useless. Thanks. It's growing talent. And so everybody has talent. So we grow everybody's talent. So if we need a person who is an expert or really good at doing this, then work with your team and give them the opportunity to gain experience and to practice. And it might not be then one person who can do this particular task, that it might be that three people together are able to do that task much better than one talented person, talented inverted commas. And so I do think that that's really important for organizations to recognize that actually growth mindsets need support. People need to see that they can be better, that they weren't born like this. And so Bobby, who says, I'm really bad at exams, I've never been able to do exams, then we work with you and support you to find ways that you can do, ways that you can learn that gel, that land, ways that you can remember, whether that's through finding mind maps, whether that's through mnemonics, whether that's through, what was it that Sherlock Holmes used to have, the mind palace. There are lots of ways that people can be helped to be able to do things that they think that they can't. And I think that comes back to that learning edge as well, which I think is really, really closely linked, is that you find the learning edge and then you find that intermediary point. And for everyone, it's different, to get them to step over that boundary. And then the boundary gets pushed out a little bit, doesn't it? And then it gets pushed out again, and then it gets pushed out again with baby steps. For me, I carry around one of those, not with me everywhere I go, but in the house, I've got one of those little step like little short step stool things because I can't reach anything. And Mohammed thinks it's hilarious because he's a big fucking giant, and he just tells me I should have drunk more milk. But I have a step to make up for the fact I didn't have
one
milk.
too, and Ash is going to be furious, but he uses it as well because he's cute and diddy. Yeah, I've said it. Sorry, Ash. Anyway, moving swiftly on. Oh, God, I've just completely thrown myself off my stride by ridiculing my husband. Oh, I know what it was. Exactly that point. They'll know who they are, so I won't name names. But it puts me in mind of COVID and what I did to two of my managers who professed and were to be a recruitment specialist and a learning and development specialist. Fixed. So I took their amorphous blob with their known recruitment or known learning and development in it and said, right, from here on in, you will be HR generalists. You're going to do everything. You're going to do employment law, you'll do communications, you'll be doing consultation if we restructure. In words of one syllable, but basically the technical term was, are you fucking mad? Not both of them, although one of them took to swearing a little bit later than the other. But I said, yeah, and I'll help you. And they both know who they are. One has just completed their Chartered Institute of Personal Development, which is across the whole gambit of HR. And the other one went off not to just be in recruitment anymore and to work business side in people, doing something completely different. Now, this isn't about yay me, but they are prime examples of what organisations can do when they spot that people can do more. And not even if they're spotting, just giving them the opportunity to try and to support them and to have the net around them and to let them make mistakes. And immediately get back on the horse and go, okay, so what have you learned? Let's try it again. Rather than shying away.
Bobby, I think that the really important point there, though, is the support, because in many occasions, people are just given something wildly outside their TOR to just get on and cover. And often it's because of bad planning or lack of resources, because they haven't recruited someone, or they're trying to get 2.5 persons work out of one person. And they're basically set up to fail. And it's worlds away from what you're describing, which is that you give people effectively a stretch task, but with the support and also the freedom and the safety to make mistakes and to fuck it up. Because if you are going to give a person a task that is a stretch task or is something that's alien to them or is, on the cusp of being beyond their learning edge, then you're responsible for the mistakes, right? You're the one who has said, we're going to take this risk, but as their leader or their boss, you're the one who then has to provide the top cover for them, rather than throw them under the bus when it all goes, if it all goes horribly wrong. I mean, there's always going to be a when, there's always going to be something that goes wrong. But as the leader, it's then your role to, one, provide top cover, and two, to be there on a watching brief to ensure that the fuck up isn't too enormous.
Exactly that. And if there's anybody else who's worked with me listening to this, they're not the only two I did this to or did this with. I take some really level of gratitude when people are saying, she got me to do things I never thought I could. And that, for me, is what a leader should be up to if progress is going to be made. To know their individual people, or to have people working for them who know their individual people, that know that the learning, that the magic happens just outside of the known boundary. It's so important.
Yeah, and it's you having the leader, having the belief in the person, even when they haven't got that belief yet.
Absolutely. And there needs to be quite a significant level of trust, because as I say, I think they both thought I was completely nuts. And there's been people before them going, you want me to do what? And I'm like, yep, it's all right. We're going to, and there's a level of doing it together. So, some of the benefits that I find about, being in organizations with a willingness to let me go poking around at people's learning edge is that I learn and develop by developing others. It doesn't just happen with coaching, but that whole business about, because there is an element of teaching and educating from your own experience to give them some kind of frameworks so that, and they can just keep coming back and testing and adjusting. And, not that I don't want anyone to think that I put anyone on a lead when they're working, but you then loosen the lead, so that you don't need to keep coming.
Back to exactly, the BDSM again,
all the way back round like we normally do. But it's you don't need to come back and check with me this time. You've got it. And so you're building their confidence. You're building a level of empowerment, again, that word, but there's a level of resilience to it. They're adapting. There's all sorts of other things that come from it if you take the time to do it. I think the other thing I was going to say, if I bring it back round to that, what triggers us to go back into our defensive, smaller, fixed way of being, criticism is one, comparing ourselves to others. So I know for a long time, first and foremost, with exams, my narrative was I can't do exams. So hey presto, self-fulfilling prophecy. Having been in that example of being over-promoted without support, so I was set up to fail. Yep, the organisation needs to take some level of responsibility for that. But I'd given off the vibes that I was smart enough. I have to own and accept what I'd stepped into, and then didn't have the nous to say, I can't do this. I need help. Yeah.
Self-reflection.
And so, after some time, and having learned the hard way first time around, that needed to change. Now, we've had an episode with Steve White. He was that leader who showed me where my learning edge was and pushed it. And I trusted him enough to let him push it so that I did something different. And then it's gone gone from there. So I have also been in that place where I go back into hiding or whatever it might be. But I think that also taught me about how important it is to get people to say, I need help. I've made a mistake. As well as, look what I've done. I've done what you've asked. And so back to that praising the progress, but also supporting when the magic hasn't quite happened, but how much you learn from a mistake.
Yeah. I guess I always view it as going on an adventure with someone. And I think that whenever we've been doing our little tasks at UCD, one of the things, and I think that the facilitator is very aware that people, one of the reasons why a lot of people don't try to do things is because they're afraid of failure, or they're afraid of doing something wrong, not doing it the right way, assuming that there is a right way, because obviously, when you look at it from the outside, the whole idea of creativity is to stop thinking like that and to stop thinking that there's only one way to do things. And they used to always say, they give us a task, and you could see everyone talk about somatics. You could see the reaction in people's bodies was, oh no, I don't know what I do this. Oh. And he or she would then go, it's an experiment.
Yeah.
And that word then, for many people, you could see the relaxation in the body. Oh, it's not real. It's not suddenly it made sense that they could try, and it didn't matter if it wasn't a huge success because it was an experiment. It wasn't a task. So using those words, they'd say it's experiment. And then everyone would feel much more relaxed about, or it's a game. You say either it's a game or it's an experiment. And looking at things as an adventure, also for me, I'm much more willing to sort of step down that path, even if it's a bit scary, if it's an adventure. And I know that someone's with me to sort of be there to support me, or for me to turn around and go, oh, which way? So yeah, I do think there is a narrative change that needs to happen for many people. And we need to be careful about that.
I love the word adventure, which puts me in mind of the quote I have to complete, but I would not want to be completing if there wasn't anything else that you wanted to give the old ooh, 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 and another thing to.
No, I'm good. No more geese, no more BDSM.
I'm almost disappointed. So yeah, mind maps with God knows what, geese. I have no idea why I try to correlate working in an organisation with being good at javelin throwing, but it's in there now, so there's not much we can do about it. But the quote to end, this plays to your point about adventure, Bridge. But D.H. Lawrence says, life is a travelling to the edge of knowledge, then a leap taken.
Yep, that sounds like life to me.
Thanks, Brid.
Cheers, Bobby.
Bye.
See you next week. Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you want to learn more about anything discussed in this episode, we've provided links on our website and on the Spotify podcast page. Go on, do some everyday learning. And next week, on the cusp of International Day of Happiness, guess what we'll be talking about? Well, at least to start with, join us for being happy with happiness. See you then.